I beg you to try it, Patricio.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricio. You were there once in your life.
Hi, people. Trish Wood here. We have a major show for you today. And the show that we have for you is on propaganda, the thing that has driven all of us nearly mad for 3 years as it's been applied to COVID reporting. And now it's being applied to, even more than usual, all kinds of foreign reporting out of the US, out of Canada. And we're going to deal with that stuff head on. We've got some really, really good guests. One of them really high profile, the other high profile too. And you're going to learn a lot. So stay tuned. Out of London, I'm pleased to have Piers Robinson. He is a political scientist. He's the co-director of the Organization of Propaganda Studies, the convener of propaganda in media, and he served on the board of several academic journals. So he's the real deal. And he's a person who sits back and watches what we watch and hears what we hear and says, wow, you know, somebody's really ginning up propaganda there. He knows what's real most of the time and what's not. And so he's going to help us move through this kind of corrupted, let's put it that way, this corrupted informational silo that we swim in, trying to get to the bottom of some really, really important stories. You know, they ain't playing, right? We're looking at World War III. Putin's mad. Putin's got nukes. They don't seem to want to do anything to calm him down or make peace with him, which I absolutely believe they should. These are bad days. So the propaganda that we are being, I'll say, attacked with is becoming more and more aggressive and more toxic and more detrimental for our mental health too. You know, you try to avoid it if you can. So let's talk about how it's manifesting itself first, like in the moment, right? So we're going to have a longish clip on the show from a guest who is going to be what we call premium content next week for our paying subscribers. His name is Seymour Hersh. And I am smiling from ear to ear that we got him on the show. We just finished the interview now. We're going to use a little clip of it to give you a taste of what's happening. And I hope that you will want to hear more of what this absolutely senior, credible, hardworking, investigative reporter has to say about the Nord Stream pipeline and the CIA-driven pushback of which both the New York Times and Zeit, which is a German weekly, bit to write stories about to push back his story, which claims with a lot of evidence and inside voices that Biden was behind it, which we all knew anyway, but he's got what did the kids say? He's got the receipts, right? And it is Cy Hersh. It's a funny story how I got him to come on the show too. I've been interviewing Cy on and off for about 40 years. And I really wanted to get him and I couldn't find his email. So I went back into some boxes of old work papers and I went through some of my old phone books from decades ago. I keep them. Most reporters do. And I finally got to one where I found Seymour Hersh. There was 2 numbers, a landline and a cell phone. And I thought, wow, why have I got a cell phone for this guy? You know, I thought this was older than that. But interestingly, I had no email way to approach him, which is a much more gracious way to kind of appear in somebody's life again after all those years, especially if you want something from them. But I didn't have that. I only had a direct line to Seymour Hersh, like the world's most famous Pulitzer Prize winning reporter, the My Lai massacre, Abu Ghraib, like he reported a ton of hugely important stories. And I'm kind of a fangirl. So, you know, it was nice to be able to call him, but he picked up, he was lovely. Trying to remember who the heck I was from the times I talked to him back in the 80s when I was at CBC. I'm not sure he really fully grasped it. I'm sure he meets a lot of people who like me who want to interview him, but he said yes. And so I'm going to play you now a clip from the interview we did this morning. It is preceding our interview with Piers Robinson, who was also wonderful. And I will say, Piers was interviewed before I talked to Cy Hersh. So we don't discuss Cy Hersh's wonderful reporting in that interview, but we do talk about other important things. So here is just a little taste of my interview with Seymour Hersh on his latest piece, which came out, I think, yesterday. The name of it is The Cover-Up. The Biden administration continues to conceal its responsibility for the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. His first story, which we also talk about, explains how America took out the Nord Stream pipeline. The New York Times called it a mystery, but the United States executed a covert sea operation that was kept secret until now. And that was published on good old Substack, too. So isn't that great? Anyway, here's a clip.
2021. War is cooking, and Russia's going to come. And Biden is looking for ways to stop him. And Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, one of wink and blink and nod people, convened a meeting of a high level. The first thing I wrote was sort of an inside account. And I can acknowledge I don't name sources. I don't have anybody in a meeting, but I know when I was at the New York Times, I must have written 800, 1,000 stories. I'd say 5 or 6 of them, a lot about negative stuff about the CIA, spying on American citizens and going after Allende and stuff like that. And I think 5 maybe had named sources. How can you write what I'm doing if I'm not protecting people on the inside that talk to me? But anyway, it's
right.
It's
of course.
Anyway, they don't like the story they use. That's an easy way to get rid of a story. And so what happened is they convened the meeting at the White House and across the street at the EOB. I even named pretty much where it was. And the question, they had the CIA, the NSA, National Security Agency, our SIGINT people, Signals Intelligence. The Joint Chiefs had a representative. The services probably had 1 or 2 representatives. Not big of a meeting, not many, but they convened a meeting about options. This is before Christmas of 2021. The war begins in February 2022, 3 months later. So we're looking for a way to back off Putin. And the group was asked, and this is the words I'm now using are words of art that were used. So the White House is certainly where somebody was talking to me. They're not going to acknowledge that. But the questions they asked the group was, State Department was there, the Treasury Department. We want options to present to threats to Putin to stop him. And the question the group asked, are they to be reversible or irreversible? Reversible would be more sanctions, getting rid of McDonald's and all that stuff. And irreversible would be something kinetic. What emerged over the next month of meetings was, let's threaten the pipelines, let's blow them up. And that was briefed to the White House sometime in mid-January. What was briefed, there's a capability. We think we can do it. That means you got to use the best divers, which we have. You also have there's a big country in Europe that we've been doing covert operations with long before the Vietnam War and World War II, Norway, working against the Nazis then.
Tell me, Cy, tell me, just interrupt here. So tell me about this diving team that they chose who, I think they're from Panama, and they don't have to kind of report to Congress, do they?
So what it is, normally we think of the American SEALs, Special Forces, as being the people you go to. But once you go to anybody in the Special Forces business, you automatically are required to call Congress. If you use Navy divers who are not in the SEALs, who are in the military chain of command, you can get away without doing it. It's all just a game, whether you have to report to Congress. And believe me, if you think this White House, under the rules that we now have, any covert operation has to be briefed to the Gang of Eight. That is the leaders of the House and Senate and the leaders of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. But if you think this White House wants to tell McCarthy anything, you're wrong. The system doesn't work. Yeah. It just doesn't work. But that's another question. That's a bigger philosophical question. In the short run, they kept it away from special operations. The Navy has a diving school in Panama City, Florida, which is in the middle of nowhere. 70 miles south of the Alabama line. way in western Florida. It's just, as far as I know, it's got some fishing there, Gulf of Mexico, some sword fishing, and a lot of mosquitoes. But this Navy training place, and they train great divers. And the Navy divers, they make fun of the SEALs. The Navy divers say the SEALs are swimmers who go on television every time they have a good hit and talk about it. These guys don't talk. So they found the way you do a covert operation is you keep it small. You don't have a lot of people. We set it up in Norway. The team, once they decided they're going to have this option, they began planning in Norway because the Norwegians have 1,400 miles of coastline along the Atlantic coast from Oslo on the edge of Europe. Oslo is the capital, on the edge of Europe, all the way up to the Arctic Circle where Russia is there. And we have put, I said hundreds of millions, it's probably more than a billion. We have rebuilt in the last year, put up a major synthetic aperture radar, which is the most advanced radar to spy on the other side, way up north in the Arctic. And one of the major Russian nuclear weapon fields is there. So it's very convenient to be that far north and spy using the Norwegian property. And we built a new submarine base. We've added an awful lot of money invested in a Navy, a Norwegian base that's up north. It's become a fortress for us to spy on Russia. It's legal. It's part of the game. It's all on Norwegian territory. And the Swede border is right there too. And Sweden doesn't like Russia any more than we like Russia. So anyway, the point of it is you set it up. You use 2 divers. There's 4 pipelines. You got to blow them up. It takes a long time, a lot of practice. But in January, they could tell the White House, we think we can do it.
That was a clip from my new best friend, all the way from Washington, D.C., Seymour Hersh, known to the many people who love him as Cy Hersh, reporting on how America blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And then in a second, that was on Substack, yay. He's on Substack now, like all the good people are. And then a second piece called The Cover-Up, where he debunks, they're trying to debunking of him, right? So it's really fun. And he's still at the top of his game. Not only are the stories well researched, but they're also very well written. I was gobsmacked by how well written they are, actually. He's a good writer. That's a wonderful skill to have. He did write for the New Yorker and all those places too. He won the Pulitzer Prize. He was the top man working on many, many of the big stories. But at one point he flew too close to the sun. The NatSec got angry at him. The Democratic Party got angry at him for exposing all kinds of stuff he wasn't supposed to expose. The Republicans got mad at him, so he was sidelined for a minute and a half, but he's back, and I'm so glad he's on Substack. So that's the clip of Cy Hersh. You can hear the whole shebang, as they say, on my Substack on Monday. It's a premium content interview for our paying subscribers, and you're going to love getting to meet him and then hearing about this amazing story. So do go over to Substack and sign up if you can. If you can afford it. If you can't, that's fine too. But if you can afford it, it'd be great if you would. And you can hear the full interview with Seymour Hersh, maybe the best living reporter in the world. I want to be him when I grow up. Okay. So our theme today is propaganda, and it's something we've all lived through. COVID was a propaganda play, may I say that. Most of what was happening, most of what was said was either an exaggeration or designed to scare people or nonsense, right? Should we go through it? The vaccines are safe and effective. That's propaganda. The World Health Organization changing the definition of herd immunity to exclude natural immunity, which is a thing and actually has been proved to be better than vaccines. So in the WHO's eye, they changed this during COVID. Only herd immunity can be created by vaccine responses creating antibodies, and natural immunity is written right out of the formula. It's a complete lie. Imagine the World Health Organization doing that. It's just terrible. The other propaganda were these massive case counts, so-called case counts. What they were positive test results. How many of those people had no symptoms at all? And of course, asymptomatic spread has been debunked by both Tony Fauci and Dr. Kirkova from the World Health Organization early on. They stopped singing that song, but when they realized they needed asymptomatic transmission to keep the people scared and the country locked down, then they started hyping it up. But they initially said it was not a thing. If people don't have symptoms, they're not spreading it. And that makes sense because if you don't have a high viral load, you're not spluttering virus all over the place. Like if you're acting perfectly healthy and your nose isn't stuffed up and you're not coughing and sneezing, you're not spewing out very much virus because you don't have that very much in there. That's just the way it works, the mechanics of it, right? It's simple. So that was also propaganda. There's lots and lots and lots of it, but most of it was around the vaccine, wasn't it? Oh my God, they changed the story. It stops transmission. Well, maybe only partly it stops transmission, but if you are transmitted and you get it after being vaccinated, you'll be less sick. You won't be as sick. So that's good, right? Like they have all these various scenarios around. They're just ridiculous as the vaccine was failing. And the other propaganda was that, it's healthy, right? It's not healthy. Many, many people have been harmed and killed by the vaccine. It doesn't make me an anti-vaxxer. It makes me someone who's reviewing science. And there's lots and lots and lots of august scientists out there who agree with that. But the politicians and the news media who are complicit in mandates and scaring the public won't admit it. Right. But that was the propaganda. Let's not forget the good old Toronto Star, the cover page of the Toronto Star printing all of the hate speech toward the anti-vaxxed, and John Tory pushing ice cream cones and vaccines on young children at City Hall without their parents' consent. I mean, it's craziness, right? That's all propaganda. It's all propaganda. And the propaganda isn't just there for no reason. It's there because they want to control us. They want us to think a certain way, don't they? Right? So there's a new documentary out. It's about Tony Fauci. You may have seen this, but I'm going to play this forever because it's so great. It brings me joy. And we should all have a little joy in our lives, shouldn't we? The director of the film, whose name is Minucci, produced a film about Tony Fauci for the PBS American Masters series, which is usually about opera singers and great conductors and great actors and stuff. But somehow they have conferred upon the man who may have brought COVID to the world through gain-of-function research in the Wuhan lab that he was paying for and supporting and lies about. No question about any of that stuff. It's all true. Only fools with an agenda dispute that. Burn cleavage site, that's the dead giveaway. That's who they are saying is an American master, right? He's done many, 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 many things wrong. He's been hugely, hugely dishonest from the beginning of it. And I've got the receipts. I've seen them all. I've been doing this for 3 years, and I knew Fauci back in the day during AIDS in the 80s. I knew him. So I know what we're dealing with here. And yet somehow some nice young man who used to direct a show called Reading Rainbow has done a film about Tony Fauci. In the film about Tony Fauci is an example about critical thinking. Now, the critical thinking doesn't come from Tony Fauci, of course. He never thinks critically. He might think strategically, but he doesn't think critically. By a black man in what I'm told is not a great neighborhood of DC where the scene was filmed. And Fauci arrives with a film crew and Muriel Bowser, who is the mayor. I think I called her Marion Bowser in the tweet. It was Muriel Bowser. She's the black mayor of DC. And they are talking to residents because the residents are all vaccine hesitant. So this is what they were confronted with. I love this man. He is a great American. He comes up second in the clip. I think there's a woman first, and then the star, this man who's really mad. Here it goes.
If you were to get infected, you could pass it on to them. So you're actually protecting your family by getting vaccinated.
Well, I heard that it doesn't cure it, and it doesn't stop you from getting it.
No.
So
on the very, very, very rare chance that you do get it, even if you're vaccinated, you don't even feel sick. It's like you don't even know you got infected. It's very, very good at protecting you.
Just the Anacostia, so get up there. Okay.
All right, see you later.
Thank you. Have a good day.
The people in America are not settled with the information that's been given to us right now. So I'm not going to be lining up taking a shot or a vaccination for something that wasn't clear in the first place. And then you all create a shot in miraculous time. It takes years to create vaccination.
Well, it used to take years.
Okay, it used to.
You know how many years were invested in this approach? About 20 years of science to get us to be able to do it.
20 years is not enough. And 9 months is definitely not enough for nobody to be taking no vaccination that you all came up with.
The only reason I'm talking to you right now, as close as we are, is that I've been vaccinated.
Right.
But if it allows thousands of people like you don't get vaccinated, you're going to let this virus continue to percolate in this country and in this world.
Something like the common flu then, right?
And
it's much more serious than the flu.
Well, the flu kills a lot of people annually, too.
You know how many people died of the flu the last year? I mean, not this year, virtually none, but the previous year, about 20 to 30,000. You know how many people have died from COVID-19 in the United States? 600,000 Americans.
Well, the number that you all giving that died, that's once again, that's you all's number.
You gonna pass?
Yeah, definitely. Because when you start talking about paying people to get vaccinated, when you start talking about incentivizing things to get people vaccinated, there's something else going on with that. Something else going on.
It is something going on.
There's something else.
You're right. But I'm glad millions of people like me and most everybody here didn't get an. You know what their incentive was? Protecting their health and protecting the city. But I won't keep you anymore.
It's okay, because my incentive, y'all campaign is about fear. It's about inciting fear in people. You all attack people with fear. That's what this pandemic is.
Amen. I just think this guy is absolutely terrific. And I know that was only the audio, but you should have seen Fauci and Bowser flee when he started talking about how fear was being used to control the people. It was really good. I've said this before. I'll say it again. I've said it a million times. It is the plain speaking, clear thinking, working class who are not corrupted by elite groupthink who are going to get us out of this. And this guy is one of them. And I would give anything to have him on my show. All I know about him from the film is that he's in house number 2022, but I don't know what street he's on. Anyway, I'd love to have him on. I hope he sees this or hears it or whatever. Okay, so that guy was not propagandized. That was my point with him. He was not propagandized. That's why he broke through. He felt so fresh and clean. And when that clip appeared on Twitter, it got a lot of positive attention because Fauci's a bullshit artist. I'm sorry. I hate to say it so crudely, but he is. And he was being very condescending with this guy. And I think this guy put him in his place. And so high five to him. And do please come on the show. Also, you know, Black Americans have a history with the Tuskegee experiments too, don't they? Where Black men were shot up with syphilis, and they left the syphilis untreated in order to see the course of the disease, of the pathogen. They did that to human beings, Black human beings, right? It's awful. So, of course, they're asking big questions when big science comes to call, especially with a camera there. Good. Let me just say one more thing about that, and then we'll move to Piers Robinson, who's our guest. It is reported that the director, Mr. Minucci, relied on 10 long sit-downs with Fauci to develop trust with his subject and didn't clutter the documentary with testimonials from talking heads wanting to focus on Fauci's experience. I hope it's not viewed as a partisan message, but a portrait of who he is and what he went through. What about what we went through? I hope that people on the other side, even if they never end up agreeing with him, will at least see somebody who is a real person, a thinking person, blah, blah, somebody they can relate to. Never going to happen. So he did 10 long interviews with him. I do long interviews for my docs, right? They're between 4 and 8 hours. So let's just say he only did 4 times 10. That's 40 hours. He could have been working on reviewing files for the Wuhan lab leak, burnishing his knowledge of vaccine failures, or coming up with remedial plans to fix the children ruined by his policies, instead of spending 40 hours pontificating and posing for a film crew, which is what he did. And this is not the first doc. There are others, and there will likely be more. Fauci has an ongoing quest for the Emmy, and if he gets it, I don't know what I'll do. I'll scream into the mic one day for you. And the point is to make him into a real person, a real person who struggles through COVID like the rest of us. But you know what? There's nobody talking about the actual people who are struggling. Why aren't they in the film? Interview people who lose people. But they're not doing that. They're not treated like real people. Okay, enough of that. Isn't that a great clip, though? I hope you like it. Let's get to Piers Robinson, who is our guest today. And I'll just remind you that Piers was interviewed before I interviewed Cy Hersh. So that's why we didn't do any real discussion about that. So he's in London, England, one of my favorite places. You know that. He's a political scientist. He's co-director of propaganda studies, convener of Prop and Media, served on the boards of several academic journals, and he is terrific. So here is my conversation with Piers Robinson. Hi, Piers. How are you?
I'm very well, Trish. How are you?
Well, I'm doing very well. I must say, I never thought in my lengthy career that I would spend so much time interviewing propaganda experts, but that seems to be the world we live in now, isn't it?
Absolutely. I a number of years back with a number of colleagues, coming from a political communication background, we were frustrated at the lack of engagement with the topic of propaganda amongst academics. And this is back in 2015. And we started writing papers on it saying, look, we really need to pay a lot more attention to propaganda in democracies, not propaganda in Russia or China or historical propaganda, but propaganda happening here and now. And, we embarked on that a number of years back. And it was a time it was very difficult to talk about propaganda without being sneered at by mainstream academics or corporate journalists would get terribly upset if that was mentioned, and politicians would laugh at you. But for sure, in the last couple of years, maybe a little bit longer than that, it has become very apparent to very large numbers of the public across Western democracies that propaganda is something which happens here as well as over there. And it is quite extraordinary.
What?
Makes my life very busy, I suppose.
Well, Greg Simons is a friend too. And I think he's also really busy working on these topics, because I think what's happened now is that, and this is just my perspective, I could be wrong and I'd love your analysis, but I was a journalist long enough to know that they always spun things. They lied about the, Gulf of Tonkin and Webster, all that stuff was nonsense. But now the lies seem more prevalent, bigger, more bold, without challenge. And I think that the political class has learned with this completely ineffective legacy media that they can just boldly say whatever they want and nobody's ever going to call them on it. So it's just getting more and more bizarre from an informational perspective.
I think for sure it has become, the lies have become bigger, or the deceptions have become bigger. I do think that there's a broader, for a long time, the culture of spin that you mentioned, because this is, of course, how it was described back in the 90s, and you have spin doctors, etc. And the kind of sort of increasing encroachment of public relations professionals into government, into all organizations, all of whom work with within a kind of an attitude or a culture whereby it's actually seen as okay, legitimate, that you're there to promote as aggressively as you can your point of view or your policy or your set of arguments. And, historically, of course, propaganda and public relations and advertising, these overlap very significantly. Public relations, of course, was the term that Eddie Bernays coined in order to replace the term propaganda. Because propaganda had got a bad name.
Right.
But, in a commercial world, we're all used to companies, promoting and spinning in order to get us to buy their products. And it's kind of like accepted, tolerated. But now the way in which, the PR industry has become so integrated into government, it brings that same culture that you're there not primarily to tell the truth, but to push and to promote your argument. And I think that opens the door for the spin that you describe. And of course, spin, it can stay within the bounds of being non-deceptive for a time, but very, very quickly you can see how it slips into not necessarily outright lying, but omission of information, distortion of information, and so on, which ultimately becomes primarily deceptive. And I think this has become so deep-rooted in the political class and actually, throughout a lot of institutions as well. If you look at universities, how they promote themselves now and have done for a long time. And I think it is, and it's good to keep in mind that the PR industry is a major, huge industry in Western democracy. A lot of money goes into it. And I think that's created a context where we struggle or politicians and political actors in particular, but also other powerful actors, struggle to really engage in what one would describe as accurate communication. They're always spinning, they're always pushing. And then, of course, we now have the kind of post-truth world, the narrative world, where many people seem to absorb those ideas, and it's all about the narrative. If it doesn't fit the narrative, it's out. And if it fits the narrative, then you'll report on it and you'll promote it and so on. And that creates a very, very high levels of propaganda and very high levels of deception, which I think you're right, are at a historically high level at this point in time, certainly in the West.
Well, when you use the word spin, I will say that I was not a kind of a regular journalist. I was mostly an investigative journalist. So I was kind of hypercritical and, super suspicious anyway. It's my nature. And I never liked the term spin. I'd always say, what do you mean spin? They're lying and you're kind of encouraging it, right? So there would be, for instance, a debate, an American political debate, say, covered by all the networks. And then CNN would host what they called the spin room. I mean, here is a journalistic organization kind of acknowledging and giving acceptance to a practice that is out to deceive their own viewers. Right. But it was just part of we're all part of the political class and we're all playing this game and we know it's a game and therefore it's okay. I mean, it's offensive.
Yes, it's lack of awareness or loss of awareness of what sort of honest communication is. I think it does operate at that level where people have internalized this approach to communicating. That if you take it down to a very simple level of, when you write a CV or you write a job application or you put an ad in the Lonely Hearts column or online dating, whatever they call it these days, is that, you're economical with the truth and so on. And that has just become embedded, throughout institutions. And I mentioned before universities. I remember when I started my first job at a British university and a very senior professor saying to me that he was amazed at the kind of brochures that the university would put out. He was saying, I don't recognize this. And he used to say to me that we're just setting up the students to be disappointed when they arrive because there's so much oversell in this. But, this is the world that has been created. And as I said before, I think that the scale of the public relations industry, the culture of promotion and the amount of money which is put into it has created a situation where, functionally from a democratic point of view, people need to have access to accurate information, etc. That, the spin and the deception is so high that, it's a good case. And I'd say it's more than a case. I think it's pretty clear now that we don't have functioning democracy because of the level of deception and the level of manipulated communication that there is. And it leaves us in a very dark corner, I think.
I completely agree with that. I think we don't have a functioning democracy. And I think it's kind of, it's a double issue, because if the media were doing its job and demanding the nonsense stop, they wouldn't be getting away with it and they wouldn't be doing it, right? It was like that moment at Davos when Rebel News did the jump interview on Albert Bourla, which I still, it made my day, because, and it's not that I love Rebel News so much, but it said in the moment, first of all, you could see that Mr. Bourla was really not used to being questioned aggressively. And he hasn't been since the beginning of the vaccine controversy. And it also kind of highlighted this as old school kind of, press card in your hat, ambush interviewing somebody who should be being accountable to people given what he's doing. Right. So I thought that was really great. But the reaction to it was so profound because no one's doing that anymore. No one does that kind of thing anymore, right? I sit and watch interviews being done on television, and I'm thinking, why isn't he following up? Why is he letting him get away with that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, from a scholarly or an academic point of view, the critical literature on mainstream or legacy media has documented for decades now the proximity of mainstream media to political and economic power. And there are some classic or seminal texts. There's Herman and Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, written in the 1980s. But then there's a whole raft of other scholars, Daniel Hallin, and then myself and others, who have, again and again demonstrated that the mainstream media is not autonomous from political power, that there are a variety of conjoining factors, the economics of the industry, reliance and deference to sources, ideology, etc. But all of these things which come together to mean that media sort of doesn't really perform in a properly democratic way, that journalists aren't free to challenge power in the way that they should be and in the way that we expect them to within a democracy. And, this has been well established, as I say, for many decades, but it's just got an awful lot worse. The media industry, I think that the financial pressures, that the lack of resources for investigative journalism has made things worse. The increasing power of propaganda and so on has worsened the situation even further. To the point where we are today, where it's, as you just described with that example, sort of when an independent journalist goes out and actually does what you expect a journalist to be doing, sort of that they incur criticism. I mean, this has happened across a number of realms. I'm thinking in terms of Isabella Oakeshott in the UK with the WhatsApp from the British Health Secretary, the WhatsApp messages, Peter Hancock's.
The lockdown files, yeah.
Yeah, and of course she did it. She had signed a non-disclosure confidentiality agreement because she'd written a book on Matt Hancock, but then she was so shocked at what she saw in these messages, casually talking about overruling scientific advice, etc., joking about some of the aspects of lockdown and so on, that she just published them all. But she was the response of the mainstream media in the UK, or from some quarters, was to attack her for that.
Yes.
To attack her for sort of, burning her sources. This is ethically unacceptable for a journalist to be doing this. Whereas she said, and I think it's reasonable for her to argue this as a strong public defense for what she has done.
Yeah. Did you see the Kathy Newman interview with her?
I did. It ended. She just left, didn't she? Kathy Newman was terribly upset. Yeah. And of course, they're all terribly upset because they've all been pushing the COVID narrative.
Well, they're complicit.
And they're
complicit, aren't they? Yeah. So what you could see, and I probably will have played before we started the interview in the show when I put it together, that piece of tape, so people understand what we're talking about. But I was so angry watching that, because I thought, who are you shilling for here? You're going after a journalist doing a very daring thing in service of the public, and you're protecting the people she exposed. I mean, it was just awful.
Yeah, that kind of the punching down that you see from the legacy media journalists is quite remarkable. And I mean, I'm sure you're not very familiar with my background, but, I'm somebody, studying foreign policy and conflict. I've been hit so many times now by mainstream journalists attacking me for the work that I do. And I'm literally just doing my work as an academic, as a researcher, what I'm supposed to be doing. Yeah. But you then find yourself on the front page of, the Times, and your picture on the inside page is being accused of being, an Assad apologist or a Putin apologist, etc., or a conspiracy theorist. Yeah. And it's amazing. You think, wow, so you've got all of that power and all of those resources, and look at who you're gunning for. You're not challenging government. You're going for, a fairly sort of a relatively unknown academic who's researching an area which is problematic for the British government, and you put them on the front page, and it's so far from what that kind of the common cultural myth we have of journalists, the Bernstein and Woodward and so on, the challenging authority, going out there seeking the truth. They're just kicking people who are challenging government. And I guess in a way, Julian Assange symbolizes the most extreme example of that, where, somebody who has, with WikiLeaks, have been all about putting information into the public domain, which is in the public interest, etc., and of course focusing a lot on the wars and so on that we've been involved in. And look what has happened to him. And he's always struggled to get support from the mainstream media. I know there's been some movement in the last year, and The Guardian has finally said that he should not be extradited. But, a lot of the mainstream media were smearing him.
It's terrible.
For many years. So preparing the public to really dislike Julian Assange and not care when he gets thrown into a dungeon. And it's an embarrassment for them. I mean, you wonder at what point a lot of these mainstream journalists will start to realize what they have been involved in, at what point in their life they may reflect upon their professional careers and how they have operated. You hope at some point they might sort of wake up and so on and realize what they've been doing. But they make a mockery of their profession. And they embarrass themselves, I think, in the face of the wider public, which is increasingly waking up to the problems of the mainstream media, of course.
Yes, I think they are.
I think the trust ratings are flatlining.
Yeah, no, I think they are. And what's interesting is what the pushback looks like, because so what we're seeing here in Canada is what you guys are seeing there, and while you're in Germany, but in the UK and also in America, the pushback is that indie media is all about misinformation and disinformation, right? So they launch these attacks against us that are always general and never specific. Like, they'll say somebody's a conspiracy theorist, but they'll never say, here's the conspiracy and here's why it's wrong. They just label you, say it's disinformation, and then they move on, right? Because they know they are a dying industry. Their people are peeling, thank God, praise be that they are peeling off, right? And so instead of legacy media, especially the CBC here, where I had a long career as an investigative journalist, instead of saying, gee, what are we doing wrong? Why don't people like us anymore? Why wouldn't the truckers let us cover them? Et cetera, et cetera. They've gone on the offensive. And so what they're doing is they're working with government to try to find ways to shut down disinformation on the internet. And they're going to help, label people as, it's really awful what they're doing. It's like they're cornered, and rather than review how they got there, they're lashing out like a wounded animal. And I think this will not end well for them.
I agree entirely. I mean, there's an interesting sort of history, isn't there, as we've moved from the conspiracy theory label, which of course was very much sort of weaponized in this following the JFK assassination and pushed by, I think, the CIA level and so on as a way of discrediting people questioning power. That term, I think, sort of as it's lost traction, and certainly since 2016 election in the US, you've had the emergence, as you say, of the disinformation, malinformation, and misinformation labels, which just performs essentially the same role that the conspiracy theory used to perform. And I think that's being matched up, isn't it, also with this notion of far right or extremism, that there's this kind of conjoining of the far right with disinformation, etc., perhaps with foreign actors being thrown into the mix at various points. But it is a new, it's a new industry which has emerged. But you're right, it is a sign of desperation on their part. This is all they have now, and I've found this in terms of my own work on the chemical weapons issue in Syria. And, I'm working at the moment with Hans von Sponik and Bastani, who's the first Director General of the OPCW, in support of OPCW scientist whistleblowers in relation to that issue. And the only thing that the governments can throw back at us is that disinformation. You give them facts. You line up that there are whistleblowers, scientists who say, this is where the investigation has been distorted to favor the outcome the Americans wanted, etc. You present them with facts, and they just call it disinformation. And it's, it's entirely irrational, and it's convincing less and less people these days. And you've seen this somewhat over COVID, haven't you, with the phrase that, last year's conspiracy theory is this year's fact, and so on. Yeah. And so that, these things, there's diminishing returns if they can't engage in a civilized, rational way with people raising legitimate questions. If they can only respond with these terms, ultimately that they just further erode their credibility, and it works for a while, right? Especially with disinformation is a new term, and you've got all these nice glossy looking NGOs and think tanks who are doing this apparently scientific research to show that these people are engaged in disinformation. Entirely flawed, illogical process which they apply. And then they're throwing that term out at people.
Well, there's a grift about it, right? There's a whole, just sorry to interrupt, but I do want to just jump in here.
No, of course.
That there's a grift, a new industry now, right? They're in academia. There's a guy out west here in one of the universities. I won't mention his name. I don't want to be sued, but whose job it is to go after anybody who challenges anything about COVID-19 scientifically, including people who've been right about most of it, about lockdowns being dangerous and vaccines being neither safe nor effective. Maybe they have a role, but they're certainly not preventing transmission, natural immunity, all that stuff. The first salvo from people like him this is misinformation, right? But they don't engage. And this has been the kind of MO through all of COVID. The pushback against the Great Barrington dogs was not specific. They didn't say, this is what's wrong with focus protection. Here's why we don't like it. They said, these guys are flying in the face of public health. They're not doing what they should be doing. They were all kind of these weird ad hominem general discussions with a little bit of a flourish that was a lie about how they wanted to let it rip, which they never said, right? That was also a lie. So there's a whole kind of grift. There's the grift of the fact-checking organizations now that only fact-check in favor of the narrative. They never find for the person who's offering something off narrative, right? They always say, no. I mean, it's an industry now, right?
It is an industry. It's the term which some people are using is the counter disinformation industry. I've got a colleague who's working through Panda, the Pandata organization, looking at fact checkers and counting up the number of fact checking entities that there are around the world. And it's absolutely vast. And of course, a lot of these are funded by the usual suspects and so on, Bill and Gates Foundation. But this is, it's become an industry. it's being funded by often very powerful actors. It's engaging in a process which challenges basic concepts of freedom of expression and rational scientific debate. Yeah, it's working with the idea that you can decide what is true and what is false, and then you censor and you proceed according to that. But of course, you have no idea that you're actually correct. This is the whole point of freedom of expression, is to allow ideas to circulate and for people to rationally debate, etc. If you're playing the game of I think it's Stuart Mill talks about the assumption of infallibility which underpins any kind of censorship. And it's an erroneous assumption. You can never be sure you're absolutely right. But this is what they're doing. And you mentioned the Great Barrington Declaration. The wheels have come off with that, because they were censoring the Great Barrington Declaration as disinformation, etc. But as it turns out, they were absolutely correct. It makes the point. This is why you do not engage in those processes. You let information circulate and debate and so on, and the good ideas stand ground and so on, stand the test of time. Bad ideas sort of filtered out and so on through that process. And all of this is circumventing that and giving the advantage to powerful actors, essentially, to shut down debate. Entirely irrational, huge industry behind it. And of course, what's very worrying at the moment is that as we are now seeing the emergence of online harm legislation across multiple countries, and say in the European Union, you have the Digital Services Act, that integrates fact checkers with their monitoring and regulation of social media, which includes people who are major Twitter, for example. And so you're actually creating an architecture whereby the fact-checking industry is being integrated into legislation to control information on the internet. And it's essentially a censorship regime which is being created. It's as far away from an open, pluralist public sphere as you could possibly imagine. It's just in a way, it's a more sophisticated, subtle form of censorship of people's opinions and so on, and being sort of carried out by, as I sort of suggested cheekily before, these very glossy, nice looking NGOs, which seem to be very worthy and so on. We're here to protect the public from nasty disinformation emerging from the Russians or from the far right, etc., or the conspiracy theorists. And that's, those array of organizations are essentially underpinning and driving this censorship regime, which we're now seeing. Very worrying. I'm hoping that there's going to be enough pushback against all of this, but we'll have to see. I think you mentioned before about, democracy isn't functioning. One of the major areas now where we have a major problem is with our public spheres, and the fact that you have these essentially semi-formalized censorship regimes now in place. And that's not democracy. That's not freedom of expression. It's anything but. But that's the world that we're stumbling or falling headfirst into at the moment.
Well, and you know what's so interesting about what you just said is that they don't see it that way. And that's always the case historically when bad things happen and head toward tyranny, right? I'm just reading a book called They Thought They Were Free, about people who were part of the kind of Nazi regime and thought what they were doing was correct for a higher purpose, right? And I'm not really equating the two specifically, but I am saying that this doing bad things for a higher purpose seems to be driving a lot of this. It's like, for me, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which I used to rely on like 20, 30 years ago for info when I was doing stories about racism, like actual racism, has become this weird tool of the Democratic left in America to kind of point the invasion of the body snatchers' finger at a non-Democrat voter as a white supremacist, right? But all of this ugliness is wrapped in virtue. And as long as it's wrapped in, we're trying to protect people from hearing bad information or hearing, lies, as long as it's wrapped up that way, it's very, very hard to to take on. Because dumb people accept that, right? I think they're either dumb or captured or hypnotized or something. I don't know what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, the online, of course, online harm legislation, they play upon, in a sense, well-founded concerns and issues surrounding, for example, sexual exploitation and so on, things which are illegal and which we need to try to deal with, etc. But they then lump into their online harm bills disinformation, just manages to sneak its way in there, etc. And so they play upon these some legitimate fears, etc., in order to then widen out into sort of a broader kind of strategy or claim to be we're protecting people against harm. Disinformation is harmful, and you see this again and again. But the one thing, as we were talking before the interview started, the one thing really working against this at the moment is that, especially with COVID, perhaps COVID more than anything else, but this is also applying to the foreign policy realm, what we're seeing with Nord Stream and so on. The public there's a lot of learning going on at the moment, that what governments are saying and what they're pushing, claiming to be disinformation one year, is turning out to be not disinformation at all.
Yeah.
And I think, of course, some of the great Barrington Declaration scientists are taking to court the US government, for censorship. And, there is in a way a lot of unraveling. So there is a moment at this point in time where I think we can learn, especially as the wheels come off the COVID narrative, that it makes a very powerful argument to say, look, this is where this disinformation industry gets you. It leads you to censor scientists who are actually turn out to be correct. And it causes huge amounts of harm because you have lockdowns and you have injections being sort of put into the entire populations or attempted to, etc., which is doing a huge amount of damage, and that's starting to be recognized. So, and the time scale here is so, we're talking about a matter of 2-3 years where the COVID narrative was there. Everyone or many people were believing it. It's crumbled. Disinformation has been used systematically to silence scientists throughout that period. And now people are realizing that it's all, the disinformation was coming from Fauci. Disinformation was coming from governments, not the scientists. So, I'm optimistic that the counter disinformation industry are going to start to come under pressure. And also this kind of legislation that they're trying to put through will come under pressure from a number of people in the public and so on, who realize that this doesn't make any sense and this is harmful, etc. And in a way, disinformation fact-checking is integrated into the mainstream media. People, as we mentioned before, people are leaving the mainstream media in droves and going to independents, people such as yourself, and a huge array of alternative media out there. And as long as this challenge keeps on going, and I don't think it's going to go away, however hard and aggressive the online harm legislation becomes, I think they're going to struggle with this, and they're going to struggle with what people are seeing has happened over the last couple of years. Nord Stream, I think Nord Stream is a big geopolitical, obviously issue, Russia, conflict, NATO, and so on. And it's becoming very apparent to an awful lot of people that the Western governments haven't been telling the truth about that. And these are big things. These are things which are not going to be forgotten overnight.
But you know what? I want to talk about Nord Stream in a second, but I just want to, you were talking about fact checkers and mainstream media, this kind of collaboration. The absolute worst during COVID was the formerly august wire service Reuters, right? If there was any kind of a conflict around science between kind of COVID heretics with really good credentials and the Fauci story, Reuters would always rush to a fact checker to buttress Fauci. And I thought, well, how can I grew up in newsrooms where, Reuters was coming into the newsroom on a wire service terminal, a piece of paper, we'd rip it. It was such a good wire service, we would actually do what they call a rip and read, where you'd rip the copy right off the terminal and go into the announce booth and read it because you knew if it was worded, it was true. That's how much faith we had in them as a news gathering organization. And through COVID, they've been just the worst. I mean, they might as well be the publicity arm of the National Institutes of Health. So, I don't know how you ever come back from that, if anybody noticed it, but I don't know how you do.
We're at a point where trust ratings, credibility ratings for the mainstream legacy media are at historically low levels. So you look at the Pew studies in the States, but you look at surveys in other countries. They are destroying their own credibility, and they're destroying whatever trust the public had in them by conducting themselves in this way. And part of me does think that, you said, how did they ever come back? I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but I do wonder at this point if the mainstream media are actually going to be able to recover, especially from COVID, especially from the levels of propaganda that they became complicit in, which is now in various ways becoming revealed, or the truth is becoming revealed. And if you think of the way in which, COVID wasn't like a war situation. You get a lot of propaganda in wartime and so on, but wars come to an end and people move on. And in a way, most of the wars that the West has been involved in are not wars which directly affect most of the public, etc. Yeah. So it can be something which can be brushed under the carpet. Gulf War I, a lot of propaganda, sure, but that war's over and gone, and the fighting was over there, etc. But with COVID-19, the propaganda has been about restructuring and has impacted on everybody's lives in such a fundamental way. And there's such a huge, effectively, carnage coming out of this now in terms of things like excess mortality, injection injuries, etc. And this is impacting people, and a huge number of people. And I think that that might be the reason why the mainstream media who did go along with this, and it is the bulk of them, there were some exceptions, right? There were some who pushed back. Peter Hitchens in the UK, for example, very early on was pushing back. Yeah, he did. But most of them, they've destroyed their credibility, and I'm not sure if they'll ever be able to regain it. Perhaps they will. Perhaps they have the resources and the PR, but I'm not so convinced. I think people, and I was saying on an interview yesterday, people just need to start supporting the independents out there. There are lots of great independent media, either single journalists or outlets, etc. Just give up on the mainstream and start supporting people who are, of course, they don't always get it right, and of course they're not perfect. But this is the point. Democracies, public spheres, we're supposed to have, good ideas, bad ideas out there circulating so that people can think and think what they think is true and what is not true, etc., and to debate, etc. This is what we need, and this is what we want. And we just, if these alternatives are able to strengthen and take advantage of the current decline in trust in the mainstream media, that might be a positive way that we get out of this, and we move to a place where we don't have these media giants on journalists on very big salaries. And what are they doing? As you just said, I know. They're using fact checkers, and they're just pushing narratives. They're doing very little investigation in the way that it would have been understood historically with investigative journalism. And you have, and again, to be impolite, you have very little thinking going on by a lot of mainstream journalists. So, I think out with the old, in with the new. It's time to seize, I think, upon this array of independent legacy, independent alternative media, and people get behind that. And it might create a somewhat chaotic information environment, but that's a healthy thing. It's a healthy thing to have a lot of debate and a lot of discussion. And then as we move forward, the good ones will persist, and the ones who aren't so good will die down. But it will at least create a refreshing of our public spheres, which is absolutely needed at this point in time.
Well, Substack is quite interesting because, I have a Substack like everybody. Everybody has a podcast now too. But, there are people on Substack who are so extraordinary, and like a guy named Eugippius, I think he's in Germany too. is one of the best people writing on COVID, and has been and Elgato Malo too is terrific. There's a lot of really, really interesting people on Substack. Now, Matt Taibbi is on Substack, and Barry Weiss is on Substack. And so there's a lot that the problem with Substack is I'm going to go broke, because I feel when people are really putting an effort into writing that way independently, that I should support them. So I support a whole bunch of people on Substack. I'm going to have to start really being more disciplined about curating it before I hit the paid button, because probably people who are very, very interested in being informed are going to be spending $100 a month or maybe more on their Substack feeds, right? It's funny.
Yes.
A new problem. I do want to say this about what we've all just lived through. This kind of information warfare and the hostility toward anybody who spoke out against the narrative. I mean, it was vicious. It was awful. It was soul destroying. I know scientists and doctors whose lives were ruined. As an indie person, I was, I did not have a good couple of years. People thought I was one of my own kids thought I'd gone insane because I was questioning Fauci. This has not just been an informational issue. This has been a social issue, and also, I think, for the public, a mental health issue. We are not well when we are being bombarded with nonsense and hostility toward anybody who says, I want to know more. I am angry about that.
Yeah, some people, of course, use the term PSYOP, don't they, to describe COVID. And obviously, the use of fear in order to gain compliance from populations. And as Laura Dodsworth was an early book, State of Fear. Yeah. We knew in May 2020 that the behavioral scientists advising the British government were talking about raising fear levels. So this is very conscious employment of fear-mongering, which obviously has a terrible effect on a significant part of the population, making people hypochondriacs, etc. And you can see the outflow of this in terms of the mental health problems that we're seeing now. Yeah. So the employment of fear is bad enough. And if you think of, how when you go to a doctor and you go to a good doctor, a doctor will always try to calm you down, right? Well, you might be worried about something, but a good doctor will say, look, just do X, Y, and Z, you'll be fine. That's always been a sort of historical role of doctors in medicine. But look what happened with COVID. It was the complete reverse. People were ramping up the fear levels. And of course, that has, people should be angry about that. But I'd add that there's not just this kind of, promotion of fear going on. It's the coercive component of what we've seen over the last 2 years. I always argue from a theoretical point of view that the propaganda always involves this combination of, manipulated information, but also coercive dimensions where you're actually forcing and pushing people. And if you think of COVID-19, if you think of things such as the mandates and the lockdowns in tandem with the fear propaganda, this is, a powerful assault upon the autonomy and well-being of individuals. And I know it's entirely anecdotal, but I know from our own circle, the numbers of people with teenage children who have had a very tough time. It's a tough enough time as it is in their teenage years. But you add all of this and it is, people should be angry and people should be wanting answers and accountability ultimately for what has happened. Maybe we are moving to a phase now where that will start to happen. But it has been a profound assault on the well-being of populations. Criminal, I think, is the best way of describing it. And people should be angry, yes. Oh,
criminal. I completely agree with you. Not to mention young children too. But, you cannot keep people in a state of fight or flight for 3 years or 2.5 years and expect them to be normal at the end of it. And not only that, but if you add the extra layer, we all went through that. Plus, I didn't get vaccinated. I made a risk-benefit calculation. based on my risk of having a bad COVID outcome and how long the vaccine had been tested and how. And I decided I'd rather take my chances with the virus, which is kind of what medicine is supposed to be about, right? So on top of everything you just said, those of us who refused the vaccine then had this other layer of, it was almost like trauma. You know, I couldn't fly anywhere in Canada. In Canada, we couldn't go anywhere. We couldn't take a bus or a train or fly. We were trapped. I didn't see my kid graduate from university in another city. We couldn't go out for dinner. We couldn't do anything. So we had all this stuff going on around COVID, plus being punished by our psychotic prime minister, who was in love and continues to be in love with vaccines. I mean, it was a very difficult time. Sometimes when I do these interviews with people like you who get it, I get worked up. You know, I am so mad about it. And I heard Isabel Oakeshott the other day talking, the Lockdown Files person, talking about her moods around this and how she goes from, oh, maybe we should move on to, no, I'm too angry. And I'm still in the angry. I'm really mad about it. I think we need some accounting here or some kind of reckoning. It's a word I hate, but reckoning around it. It just was so cruel what they did to us.
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, here in Germany, people who had not taken the injection were not able for a long period to go into anything other than a food store or a pharmacy.
Yeah.
So it's my wife and I, you know, so it has a very powerful impact on your mental well-being when you know that you cannot go to all of these spaces. Yeah, I mean, I think people need to focus their anger and push for accountability. The other issue, and you mentioned Nord Stream, you know, what COVID also teaches us is that we are living within political, economic systems which are very, very broken. If our parliaments, if our MPs, if our leaders, if our academics, if our journalists were doing their job properly, this would have been stopped in its tracks. The response to COVID-19, the political agendas that we've seen circulating around this, whether it's the Great Reset or whether it's the economic crisis, etc., which is clearly you've seen this instrumentalization of COVID-19 for various agendas.
Yeah,
these things have, should all tell people that we have a lot of problems with our institutions and with our democracies. And for people such as myself who research and study international politics and war, we've known that there's been a big problem for a long time. But this is a point at which I think people can also think, okay, what do we need to do in order to start to fix our systems, our economic systems, our political systems? How do we regain democracy, which has been pretty fundamentally lost at this point in time? So I think yes, accountability on COVID, but also finding a way of learning from this to then start to tackle problems which have been there for a long time.
Well, they're already trying to reframe, right? They if somebody has a kid who commits suicide as a result of depression from lockdowns, they say it's a pandemic death. They don't say it's a policy death, right? They say, oh, it was the pandemic. You know, we have to start using the right language also to talk about what's happened to us, right? The virus didn't do these things. The policy did these things. And we have to start calling those things out for what they were.
Yes, we mustn't let them get away with that kind of deflecting from the issue, which of course we'll see this, I think, to a very significant extent in the coming months. But that needs to be resisted, and again, they keep on trying. These ideas of limited hangouts. You push the attention on to say, Matt Hancock, etc. But people are very quickly saying, well, yes, but he's only one part in this process. We have a problem with the World Health Organization and the way it operates. We have a problem with the Great Reset Brigade, who are talking about central bank digital currencies, etc. These things are still very clear in the minds of a lot of people, and I think As long as we can keep that in the frame, and I mean, so we collectively as a society, then there's an opportunity that this can be used to then start to engage in the kind of root and branch restructuring or restoration of democracy would be maybe is the most positive way of describing it. We need to rebuild our systems, regain the autonomy of media, regain the autonomy of academia, etc., so that those kind of checks and balances, which are essential, can be brought back. But this is a big project that needs to be undertaken at this point in time. But again, we've got enough people who've woken up to the problems, enough people who are angry. So I think there is an opportunity now at this point in time.
I think the other thing it's revealed, which kind of dovetails from what you just said, is the idea that the people who lead us in Western governments are not the best and the brightest, nor, in my view, the most moral people. And I think Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages show a kind of a selfish, not very bright, super politicized guy who cares not for the citizens he's kind of governing there. And I don't think that he is unusual. I think that we will find that, yes, there is an element of the World Economic Forum manipulation in all of this. But I think the reason they could do it is because there are so many not serious people in government in the West right now. I mean, I didn't hear any sympathy. I haven't seen in any of this stuff people weighing the harms of what they were doing or caring one whit about the people who'd be hurt by what they were doing. So it says something about those people to me too, that I think we need to really, really think about the next time we're voting in an election.
Yeah, I mean, I think another way of putting that is that the reality is that we have a very corrupt political, or we have very corrupt establishments across the West.
Yes.
And yes. That brings in these kind of people such as Matt Hancock, who do not sort of have the gravity or intelligence of perhaps in earlier eras with politicians in those positions. But it is corruption, I think. And, whether you look at for example, the Epstein issue, look at Whitney Webb's work on Epstein and what's been going on in relation to that. These are all very powerful signs that the corruption has become quite extreme. And I think I don't think this is an overclaim. I think this is, part of what we saw with COVID-19 was the kind of revolving door between the big pharma and the regulatory bodies. And people talk about regulatory capture and so on. It's another way of putting that. It's just corruption.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. What did Whitney find out? What's she reporting on Epstein?
Well, Epstein, of course, obviously there's the issue of the sex trafficking and so on. But Whitney's book, One Nation Under Blackmail, talks about the way in which Epstein and the sex trafficking was integrated with essentially blackmail. So this was, a mechanism of political control. It's something which, emanates out of the intelligence services. And that, the argument is that this is, it's a mafia style operation whereby you're sort of getting dirt on people in order to then control them.
Yeah.
And so I think that's her argument is that the insight of Epstein is not just a case of elite corruption and rape and abuse and so on. It is also a political dimension to this whereby this has been a control mechanism going on. And, boy, that's big. If we're living in a society where, that is going on, then yes, it just reinforces this point that we need a very thorough reinvigoration of our democracies. We've lost democracy, I think. But corruption and very sort of, we are allowed to name the politicians, aren't we? I'm thinking of Trudeau and so on. We have sort of a very narcissistic sort of core of politicians, or a lot of them, and they are quite remarkable, aren't they? Because you do wonder a little bit about, do they have self-awareness? Sort of what is going on in their minds? But they're clearly a million miles away from sort of leaders of earlier generations who, whatever criticisms you might make of them, you've got a sense that there's some sense of gravity here, and there's some sense of perhaps even, sort of being honourable, etc.
Yeah.
I mean, these people are, I won't say any more on it, but these are not people who you would, I don't know, buy a used car from.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, he's a joke, and people around the world, say that. And his response to the truckers, which we talk about a lot on this show, was completely corrupt, and the outcome of it was based on a propaganda campaign he started as soon as they were on the road and getting a lot of attention. And he started with they're white supremacists, they're misogynists, they're this or that. So by the time they hit Ottawa, everybody in Ottawa who lived there was terrified of him. Right? That was what he did. And then I had a guy, Ray McGinnis, who writes for Covert Action on the show last week, who did a kind of a minute by minute, detail by detail takedown of every single serious accusation made against the convoy. And it was all lies. And they were all exposed as lies in the commission report about the Emergencies Act, which found, surprise, surprise, nothing. I mean, it was a kind of, they both did bad things. It was like the 9/11 commission report.
Yeah, I know Ray. Ray's written some pieces for Propaganda and Focus.
Yeah, it's a terrific
on
story.
That issue.
Yeah, it's a terrific.
It is quite extraordinary. But again, at least the one good thing in all of this is that a lot of people have woken up to this. I think a few years back, there would have been much greater popularity of some of these politicians, but people have realized how shallow that they are.
Oh, it's just embarrassing. It's embarrassing.
But yes, it's embarrassing. Yes.
Yeah, right. Because the other problem is that a lot of this propaganda now, both in the States and here, and maybe a bit less so in Britain, is directed toward people who are not liberal or who do not vote Democrat or liberal or New Democrat here, right? And so they have this whole propaganda arm that anybody who, like the truckers, who is not kind of playing for that team is automatically a number of terrible things. I don't have to list them. You know what they are. And it's really hard to escape that, especially because the media has gone all in. We have, if anybody is even remotely populist in their political leanings, they are automatically alt-right, far-right, anti-Semitic, racist, the whole 9 yards. And they never provide evidence for those claims, ever. They just say that stuff because the person is not ideologically in league with what is the kind of approved thinking of the moment. And that is very scary for me because it means, working people have less access to the levers of power.
It seems to be particularly bad in Canada.
Yeah.
But we have this here in Germany. I mean, the protests on COVID and then the anti-war protest a week so back in Berlin, led by Sarah Wagenknecht. Sort of the mainstream German media will immediately go to these people are Nazis.
Yeah.
Anti-Semitism gets thrown in there regularly, or they're conspiracy theorists. And, I was at that demo at the Brandenburg Gate, and it was amazing because I think there was upwards of 50,000 people. Jeffrey Sachs spoke by link up and so on. Mm-hmm. There's probably about up to 50,000 people at quite short notice on anti-war demo in relation to the Ukraine. And of course, the mainstream, I think the mainstream media were a bit more cautious on this because I was looking around the crowds and you're looking at sort of, middle-aged and then 50, 60-year-olds. They look like the anti-war CND movement from the 70s and 80s. These people did not look anything like. And I think, this was happening during COVID, but people were already coming through and sort of saying, well, wait a minute, here's the picture in the mainstream German media. And they focus in on a sort of a small number of protesters and so on who might be far right. Mm-hmm. But people are saying, well, this does not capture the reality of what was going on. And however hard the mainstream media worked to demonize, you could see it pushing through and you could see people sort of, you could be coming back from a demo on the train and people would be saying, this is, I was amazed at the range and diversity of people, just normal everyday people there. So, again, as with the disinformation smear, they hurl these labels, they use these labels to discredit people, but ultimately, it works for a while, but then at some point people sort of, they look around and go, wait a minute, I've seen a picture of the protesters. I couldn't see any Nazis. This looks like a group of, 60, 70-year-olds who want peace.
Yeah. And
it does, it erodes and but I know it's bad in Canada and it's been particularly extreme, it seems. But for sure, but they're playing that card. It's far right terrorist and
driven by the prime minister, which is what's so odious about it, right?
Yeah, and again, one of the positive ways of looking at it is just think, well, it's a sign of weakness on their part. This is all they have to come back with. They can't engage with you rationally. They can't engage you in a civilized way. All they can do is to try and label you as something which you are not, and then discredit you. And you just keep standing. I mean, myself as a researcher and academic, I've been hit with plenty of smears for many, many years. But ultimately, I'm still standing. I still publish, and et cetera, et cetera. And people, a lot of people can see through those smears and that character assassination which goes on. And when they're doing it to whole populations, people wake up fairly fast, I think, over time. Not the extreme center, not the sort of elite bubble who are sort of, self-deceiving, etc. Sure, they think they're on the right side of history and they're surrounded by the barbarians at the gate and the far right, etc.
Yeah.
But that's just that little bubble there. Then there's the rest of us who can see that these are not accurate representations. And so on.
So we had here, I guess it was week before last. I didn't intend to ask you this, but I will. Christine Anderson, who was quite a vocal anti-COVID. I think she's German from the Europe. Yes. What is the story on her? Because she came here as an anti-COVID parliamentarian, I guess, and was trashed by the prime minister as some right-wing nut. What are the facts on the ground about her?
I'm familiar with her, but I don't know a huge amount of detail, so I wouldn't really want to talk because I don't have any authority on it. Talk at length, but what I would say, she's from a right-wing party, but all of the right-wing parties. I mean, obviously there are elements of extremism in Europe, and no one's denying that. But then right-wing parties who, and people within right-wing parties who are not Nazis get labeled as that and so on. I think she's one of them who is presented as being an extremist. And it's essentially a very disingenuous representation of her.
Yeah.
Zara Wagenknecht, who's in Die Linke, sort of gets attacked for sort of being sympathetic to fascism and all sorts of insults being hurled at her and so on. But they are genuine politicians. They're politicians who believe that all sectors of the working class haven't been properly represented, that we need to take on board people with both right and left-leaning views. And of course, this is an argument. I mean, you hear Jimmy Dore saying this now in the States, and you hear Russell Brand saying this, that we really need to just try to talk across political divides and not fall into the trap of seeing everybody on the right has got to be a racist or has got to be, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, there are those issues at the margins and so on, but most of the time we're talking about people who are just, in a different political corner, but they're people and they're genuine and they're concerned about their lives and their well-being and their future and so on. And we need to try to, find a way of them being properly represented. And I think that's what a politician such as Christine Anderson tries to do. But in doing that, the easy way out for the extreme center, as I keep calling it, is to just smear her as well, they've probably never come out with, sort of a clear claim of a Nazi, for example.
They don't ever have examples. Yeah, they don't.
And they never have examples. So it's just a smear.
It's just a smear,
and extremely unfair. And I mean, I do think more broadly, we are at a point where we do need to think beyond the left-right paradigms.
Absolutely.
We do need to recognize that kind of the biggest problem we've got, whether you're sort of left-leaning or right-leaning in terms of political views, that the biggest problem we've got is a very corrupt political center.
Yeah.
Until we sort that out, there's not much point in debating anything.
And I think what's happened too is that, and I'm just assuming this about her, I did some research. I couldn't find anything except that the terrible thing anybody can be these days is somebody who questions the amount of immigration. And I think this was kind of after Merkel had been fairly extreme in what was being acceptable in Germany. And there seems to be no language now where people can say, as citizens, well, we want this, we don't want that. If you question immigration at all, you're automatically a bad person. And I think maybe that's part of what was being thrown at her party too, because there were questions about immigration. Certainly happens in the States, which has got a completely open border right now. And if anybody questions it, they're white supremacists. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, it's the issue that the liberal centre it's very easy for affluent middle class liberals to talk about sort of immigration and so on, and to not have the experience or to have the understanding of people who are in poor areas and so on, where things are difficult, etc. And these things can create problems, not because people are racist, but because the burden falls upon the poorer people in society.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the problems. The other issue, I think, from a European perspective, in terms of a lot of the immigration, and this would be sort of my critique coming from somebody who looks at international politics and war, is that a lot of the immigration issue is due to conflicts, Syria, Afghanistan. They're due to conflicts which we are directly involved in and fueling, if not instigating.
Right.
So we're creating, we've been creating havoc in the Middle East since 9/11. And we all know now that the planning that was going in, we all know about obviously the controversy. You've had Ray McGuinness on about 9/11 itself, but we've had wars going on which have been fueled and driven, which have created chaos, and which has created a lot of the dynamics of the immigration and so on. So this idea, this liberal centre who sort of see this as in a very simplistic way, which doesn't recognise where the burden falls on the poorer parts of the population, and refuse to even start to recognise that maybe part of the problem is us. Maybe if we do start wars in countries or fuel wars, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, we're going to create these problems.
And so what's sad about that is the public never wants these wars. They don't.
No, not at all.
Right? We have to pay the price at the end with money and perhaps immigration levels we don't want, whatever. But nobody asks us. They just do it. And then, then the people who live in the country where the conflict is happening suffer. We sometimes suffer. Certainly, I don't understand the amount of money that the Americans are spending in Ukraine right now. That is just blowing my mind. I don't get it. So it's not about us at all. And I don't think we should ever have to pay the price for their foolishness,
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's move on to Nord Stream, because that's a very interesting propaganda play. So when it first happened, people were digging out these old clips of Biden and various people in his administration saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to do away with Nord Stream. We can't have Nord Stream, right?" Then Nord Stream blows, and they say, "Well, we never said that." But Hersh says they did do it. Clearly, they did it. I mean, they tried to say Russia did it, but really. So, but now there's a new kind of, I guess it's a kind of a propaganda line of attack. So tell me that story, because it's really a good one.
Well, I mean, obviously the situation in the Ukraine and the war which is going on there, this is, we mentioned the 9/11 wars. I mean, this is an endpoint. This is the Western military industrial complex. And, it had strategic failure in Afghanistan a year ago. It's ground to a halt in the Syria regime change operation. But they've rolled the cards on, let's see how far we can expand NATO and push Russia to the brink feeling it had to act, etc.
Yeah.
And so this is a very extreme move that was taken. This pushing, because it is a war which is being pushed by NATO. There's no doubt about it. And this is, extremely risky and extremely dangerous. It's an extremely big issue in terms of geopolitics and international politics. And then, of course, as part of the Nord Stream, the pipeline from Russia through to Germany, blown up in September. Obviously, this was, as you suggested, this was, almost definitely carried out by America or some of its allies. Cy Hersh, of course, had his scoop a month ago saying that his source said that it was, a US-led operation who carried it out. Certainly not Russia. And now this extraordinary story has emerged after the German Chancellor visited Biden a couple of days ago. We're suddenly being told that a small group of private Ukrainians or oligarchs carried out the attack. And quite where this is going, on the one hand, this could be, and we have to speculate here because, the information is all just coming in at the moment. On the one hand, this could be this kind of desperate response to Cy Hersh's scoop that, okay, the wheels have come off. America did carry out what is an attack on one of its allies, Germany, because it's German infrastructure. It's jointly owned with the Russians. And so on. The wheels have come off. People know that America, that we need to find some way of creating an alternative story to try and pull people away from recognizing that. So we bring in this idea of a group of private Ukrainians who carried out the attack. It could be that which we're seeing. It could also, some people have speculated that is this creating an opportunity for an off-ramp for the West? Is it an opportunity to distance from the Ukraine and to call it quits, as it were? Because on the ground, the Russian military is continuing to make advances. It's difficult to understand how militarily NATO could retake that territory or to take Crimea without massive mobilization of troops, which is not going to happen. So, they could be losing this war, I suspect. And so maybe now the time has come to throw Ukraine under the bus.
Yeah.
And so on. So it could be that which is going on, or there could be some other interpretations. But it's very, very interesting. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think we might be at a key pivotal moment in relation to that war. As I said before, I don't understand how NATO can win this. We can't sanction Russia. They've tried that, and of course, the world economic situation has changed. We have BRICS. Russia is just trading elsewhere. This has not impacted Russia. In fact, it's impacted Europe far worse. So there isn't that kind of economic leverage. Whatever the Western leaders tell us, global public opinion is not in support of the West, and powerful countries are sort of challenging what the West is doing in relation to that war. So I'm not sure if they can push it any further. And militarily, can they really take that land, which is essentially bordering on Russia, now part of Russia? Can you really take that territory without massive numbers of troops going in right on the Russian border? It doesn't look feasible at all. So they might be facing strategic failure at this point in time. And they're going to have to find a way of getting out of it without complete loss of credibility. But maybe that is what we will start to see. Strategic failure on the part of NATO, an awful lot of, the Atlantic Alliance, the chattering classes talking about we will defeat Russia, we will regain all the territory. Well, you couldn't. This was not possible. And you failed. And, I've said in other interviews, Suez is always a good historical example to look at, that when Britain conspired with Israel and France to attack Egypt, and so Britain could go in and retake the Suez Canal, the wheels came off that operation, and it was the beginning of the end of the British Empire. The Foreign Office community realized that Britain didn't have the military or economic clout to hold on to the Suez Canal. and that this was the beginning of the end. They had to change course. And it might be that Ukraine and the conflict and in relation to Russia is that kind of moment for the Western Empire, where it becomes transparently clear to everyone that not only do we do naughty things such as blowing up pipelines, but we're also unable to achieve what we claim to, we set out to, in terms of victory. We fail, we lose. And that will be a sobering moment for the West, which has dominated for a very long time, obviously. But we might be at that point. I emphasize might.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The propaganda campaign on behalf of West intervention in the conflict is, I've never seen anything like it. I do speak to Colonel McGregor once in a while, and I think he's pretty smart. I actually, if I were watching legacy media's coverage of this, I would have no idea what was going on. Everything seems to be a kind of a set piece about some narrative, a plucky Ukrainian village fights back, or women are knitting sweaters for the soul. I mean, it's just this kind of ludicrous stuff. Nobody's actually covering the war. And I guess they don't want us to know what's going on in the war. But people who listen to my show, when I've questioned the ability for Ukraine to win it, get mad at me as if I'm being somehow disloyal to the Ukrainian people, when what I want for the Ukrainian people is to live. I want them to live because they've signed an agreement, which keeps being obviously pulled down by the Biden State Department. They don't want talks going on. So it's amazing how many people that understand the propaganda around COVID think they're telling us the truth about Ukraine. That's why I can't. Okay.
It is, although, as we were talking a little bit earlier about the big demo in Berlin, however much the mainstream media are pushing the propaganda, presenting a very black and white image of what is going on, and one which aligns with what Western governments are claiming, there is not widespread, certainly in Germany, support on the ground. And that demo was a very big demo called at short notice. And there is not a constituency of support which they can draw upon. A lot of people do see through this.
Not here, not in Canada.
From COVID.
Yeah, not in Canada.
Possibly not. Yeah, Canada does. I'm sympathetic to your plight in Canada. It does. I think things are particularly bad in Canada.
Yeah.
But in here in Europe and in Germany, you don't see Ukrainian flags on the street. You see them on some government buildings, but you don't see people who are wearing lapels or in windows. There probably is in some parts, but there's certainly not any kind of sense of there's huge support and some people are buying into the propaganda. A lot of people are very cautious and very skeptical and very questioning. So, in some ways, the people, a lot of people fell in line with the COVID propaganda. But I think a smaller section of the population fell in line with the Ukraine propaganda from early on. And now I think with everything happening with the Nord Stream scandal emerging, awareness of the reality of some of the groups in Ukraine that we're supporting, some of the neo-Nazi groups, I think, it will come off the rails in the same way that COVID-19 has finally come off the rails, and people will develop a more accurate picture of what's going on. And
we will see Zelensky and his Vogue magazine wife retiring to a multi-million-dollar house in Miami that nobody can figure out how they afforded, right? That's what's going to happen because that money seems to be disappearing. I don't like him. The arrogance of the demands he makes, it kind of rubs me the wrong way. And,
he was calling on American, men and women to go to fight.
Yeah. That's what he said. Well, if we don't defeat him, you guys are going to be over here. I know. Yeah. I just like how this guy was made into a Churchillian figure by the media is beyond me. I just think he's kind of a scummy little guy in fatigues and, I just don't. Yeah, he's not Churchill.
Marketing and propaganda.
Yeah.
But as we said at the start of the interview, propaganda and marketing, which is off the charts. The deceptions are so extreme now and becoming so absurd that, we have these people who are, almost characters who are sort of puffed up and put into place and so on, and then presented to us as some kind of comparison to Churchill or Roosevelt and so on. It's quite extraordinary. We are living in extreme times in that sense.
Yeah, with massive corruption.
But maybe that's just the reality of where we are in across the West. We're at a point of probably crisis and change, and things are getting a little bit crazy, as it were, and extreme in that sense.
What do you do to not lose your sanity? How do you navigate this personally?
Well, I have a family, and so that obviously, you need to detach from what's going on in the world. I think, for me, remaining positive is quite important. That sort of, however tough things look, people go through hard times, and countries, civilizations go through, etc. But people come through it, and big changes can happen, but people come through it. And I think sort of keeping that sense that, we're all making some progress. People such as yourself, all these people who are challenging what's going on. Keeping that positivity is important. Keeping a focus on, family and a bit of time out from it is very important. But I think the most important is recognizing that, however absurd or extreme things become, I have faith that people will, wake up, realize, act, and get us through, and move us to a world where things are not as corrupt as they are quite obviously the case at the moment.
I hope so, because
a little bit of positivity.
I agree with you. I find, as you acknowledged a minute ago, Canada is really struggling. We're not doing well, and our media is one of the worst. We don't have even a secondary level of kind of legacy media challenging, the way Tucker Carlson knocks it out of the park once in a while on his show. We don't have that here at that level. They're all the same. They all use the same talking points. It's really, and people here, I think because we are a passive nation, what was exposed for me by COVID was how quickly everybody fell into line. The level of obedience and the hostility toward the non-obedient here was really extreme. Really extreme. I mean, the Toronto Star, which is one of the biggest papers in the country, did a full front page of nothing but people wishing the unvaccinated were dead, punished, isolated, forbidden health care. I mean, it was like it's like unbelievable. And it was accepted as a kind of a mainstream way to cover the pandemic. So I think whatever happens in a positive way is going to maybe take us a little bit longer here to get to.
Yeah, I mean, at a distance, obviously, and my perception of Canada is that it has a self-perception of being this such a powerful self-perception. We're the force for good in the world. We're the humanitarian actor. We are the ones who are right and just, and so on. And it seems, whereas in America, there's probably a lot of Americans who sort of recognize, we're an empire as well, and we kick ass around the world. Canada is this, we're the Mounties, and we do peacekeeping operations and so on. And all of these things aren't really true for the West. These are all propaganda constructs to a very large extent, this sense of moral superiority and so on, and how we act in the international system. And Canada encapsulates that. So in a way, there's a long way to fall.
Yes.
And maybe that increases the incentive for people who are at the top of the kind of structure, the power structure in Canada, just to keep on holding on and as much as you can, because you just don't want to inevitably fall from grace, as it were, which will happen sooner or later. But maybe some of these changes that we're talking about, maybe they'll have to start to get underway in other countries in the West first. Yeah. And then it will filter through to Canada if Canada's particularly stuck. So, stay positive and think, that there is movement and there is shifts going on now, and people waking up, etc. And Germany was the worst country in Europe in terms of COVID response, in terms of so extreme and dogmatic. Yeah. But and other European countries were letting go of things way before Germany. But I always said to sort of my wife and family, this will filter through to Germany. Germany can't stand alone continuing to mask and so on, and talking about mandating injections for the whole population, because if the rest of Europe are going the other way, this will filter through. So, maybe it will be the same for Canada, and maybe sort of changes in other Western countries will help sort of spur on and encourage a push to improve things.
Yeah. Well, you and CJ Hopkins, I think he's in Berlin. Do you know CJ?
I do, yes.
Yeah. I think he's terrific. Very smart guy, very good writer. Okay, look, I'm so grateful you did this.
Pleasure.
I've been wanting to talk to you for a very long time. I've been reading your stuff and following you on Twitter, and I think it's always good in the times in which we live to check in with a propaganda expert, because we're all swimming through it.
Yeah.
Right?
But plenty of work for me to do, writing up and so on in the coming years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Too much to look at.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you.
It's great to talk to you, Trish.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye. That was Piers Robinson in London, England, talking to me about propaganda. I hope you got something out of that. I sure did. He's a really decent guy and someone we should pay attention to and follow and support if he needs it. I just want to remind you of one thing, because people keep saying to me, Trish, interview this person or that person. And they're all people who've been on the show ages ago. And I think sometimes I'm too good for my own good. I get people on right when they start to break. And then when other podcasters interview them a bit, people come back to me and say, well, so-and-so had so-and-so on, why don't you? And I say, well, I did a year and a half ago when he was in the middle of a story. One of the things I have repeated in the olden days that I'll remind you of, because it's sort of important here, is that I too interviewed Tony Fauci in about 1990-91 in Washington or Maryland, I guess, and the NIH in his office, over a drug he refused to support that was actually saving the lives of AIDS patients with PCP, pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. Saving their lives, wouldn't support it without more clinical trial information. And these guys had no choice. There was no hope for them, and the pill was fine, didn't hurt anybody. Wouldn't do it. 2 years later, 17,000 people were dead. So I beat him up about that pretty badly in his office with a crew and microphones and the whole 9 yards, very 60 minutes, right? And here's what I learned about him. He is a control freak. He hates to be challenged, and he would not answer the questions honestly. That's what I will say about Tony Fauci. I've known that since 1991, and I've been saying it here and there to people who ask about it. And I hope that helps you understand a little bit about what we saw at the beginning of the show today, and that man harassing that poor black man on his own front porch. Anyway, come to Substack. I haven't done my pitch to you, have I? I'll just do it here. I'm on Substack now. If you're not, try to move your account over. And if you can't, I'll get Dorothea to do it for you. That's where the conversation is, because it's totally free speech and we can really do our thing and get down and dirty over here. Say what we feel like saying, not worry about hurting anybody's feelings. Okay. So think about that. If you feel like doing it, please do. We have merch, really cool merch, trucker merch. Take a look, go to trishwoodpodcast.com website. That is where you will find it. And I guess that's it for me today. I will say something I haven't told you before, that Chili, my Mexican rescue girl, is now my podcast dog, and she sits on the couch right behind my desk in my studio very quietly. Isn't she good? You never hear her. Sometimes she shakes, in a dog shaking can make a noise, but that's it. She doesn't bark. She's quiet as a mouse. Dogs know when important work is being done, don't they? Stay critical. See ya. To and follow and support if he needs it. I just want to remind you of one thing, because people keep saying to me, Trish, interview this person or that person. And they're all people who've been on the show ages ago. And I think sometimes I'm too good for my own good. I get people on right when they start to break. And then when other podcasters interview them a bit, people come back to me and say, well, so-and-so had so-and-so on, why don't you? And I say, well, I did a year and a half ago when he was in the middle of a story. One of the things I have repeated in the olden days that I'll remind you of, because it's sort of important here, is that I too interviewed Tony Fauci in about 1990-91 in Washington or Maryland, I guess, and the NIH in his office, over a drug he refused to support that was actually saving the lives of AIDS patients with PCP, pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. Saving their lives, wouldn't support it without more clinical trial information. And these guys had no choice. There was no hope for them, and the pill was fine, didn't hurt anybody. Wouldn't do it. 2 years later, 17,000 people were dead. So I beat him up about that pretty badly in his office with a crew and microphones and the whole 9 yards, very 60 minutes, right? And here's what I learned about him. He is a control freak. He hates to be challenged, and he would not answer the questions honestly. That's what I will say about Tony Fauci. I've known that since 1991, and I've been saying it here and there to people who ask about it. And I hope that helps you understand a little bit about what we saw at the beginning of the show today, and that man harassing that poor black man on his own front porch. Anyway, come to Substack. I haven't done my pitch to you, have I? I'll just do it here. I'm on Substack now. If you're not, try to move your account over. And if you can't, I'll get Dorothea to do it for you. That's where the conversation is, because it's totally free speech and we can really do our thing and get down and dirty over here. Say what we feel like saying, not worry about hurting anybody's feelings. Okay, so think about that. If you feel like doing it, please do. We have merch, really cool merch, trucker merch. Take a look. Go to trishwoodpodcast.com website. That is where you will find it. And I guess that's it for me today. I will say something I haven't told you before, that Chili, my Mexican rescue girl, is now my podcast dog, and she sits on the couch right behind my desk in my studio very quietly. Isn't she good? You never hear her. Sometimes she shakes, and a dog shaking can make a noise, but that's it. She doesn't bark. She's quiet as a mouse. Dogs know when important work is being done, don't they? Stay critical. See ya.